Today, we leave the present behind and walk together through memories that are no longer ours. Across time and silk roads, we will breathe the scented air of imperial China, feel the weight of scholarly robes upon our shoulders, and contemplate life through the eyes of one who lived by the brush rather than the sword. If you feel this journey touches your night, consider joining us more often, and tell us where you're listening from. Now, silence the world around you, dim the light, and take a deep breath. We're about to dream of the past. Dusk arrives like an old friend, quiet and unhurried. I sit beside my window as the light softens, transforming the garden beyond into a painting rendered in increasingly subtle shades of gray. The first raindrops begin their descent, hesitant messengers from clouds that have threatened all afternoon. Their rhythm against the paper window is irregular at first, a tentative question rather than a statement. I watch as moisture gathers and trails downward, creating ephemeral characters that seem almost intelligible before dissolving back into formlessness. Heaven's own calligraphy, written in water upon my window, delivering messages I strain to comprehend. I reach for my inkstone, a treasured possession passed down from my grandfather, a provincial examination graduate who never achieved the court, position he deserved but whose scholarly reputation sustained our family through 3 generations. The stone itself contains a small universe of history, quarried from Duanxi during the early Tang dynasty. Its surface bears the subtle impressions of countless sessions of grinding, its edges worn smooth by hands now centuries in their graves. When I trace my fingers along its contours, I touch not just stone, but lineage. The rain intensifies as I prepare my materials with practiced precision. During the Song dynasty, scholars developed elaborate rituals for ink preparation, believing that meditative attention to this preliminary process would influence the quality of the characters subsequently formed. The grinding of the ink stick against the stone should move through 3 distinct phases. First rough and vigorous to release the initial particles, then moderately firm to create proper consistency. Finally, gentle circular motions to achieve the perfect silken texture. Some masters claimed they could determine a scholar's character merely by observing how he prepared his ink. As I grind, the familiar scent rises, a complex fragrance combining pine soot, musk, and medicinal herbs bound with animal glue. This particular ink stick was a gift from a fellow scholar who journeyed to Anhui province specifically to purchase from the workshop that supplies the imperial court. Its quality is evident in both its aroma and the depth of blackness it produces. A darkness so complete it seems to absorb rather than reflect light, creating characters that appear to float above the paper rather than merely resting upon it. Outside, the garden pavilion stands empty, its curved roof now glistening with moisture. How many evenings have I spent there in better weather, exchanging verses with fellow scholars or simply contemplating the changing seasons. The bamboo that surrounds it sways in the strengthening wind, its flexibility a lesson I have tried to incorporate into both my calligraphy and my life. Rigid characters lack spirit, rigid men lack wisdom. I arrange my brushes by size and purpose, the finest wolf hair for detailed characters, sheep hair for broader strokes, mixed hair for versatility. An obscure tradition among scholar officials of the Southern Song period held that brushes should be arranged from east to west on the table, mirroring the direction of reading, and that the inkstone should always be positioned to catch northern light whenever possible. Such minor superstitions persist even among those of us who consider ourselves rational followers of Neo-Confucian principles. After all, what harm is there in honoring traditions that connect us to our predecessors? The raindrops against my window have found their rhythm now, a steady percussion accompanying my evening's work. I unfurl the scroll I've been studying, a rare copy of Wang Anxi's commentary on the Classic of Changes, controversial even 2 centuries after his death. His administrative reforms during the Northern Song dynasty divided the intellectual community so deeply that scholars still identify themselves as either supporters or opponents of his approach. Tonight, I seek to understand his perspective without judgment, to find the grain of wisdom within arguments I have been taught to question. I begin transcribing select passages, my brush dancing across the paper in the semi-cursive style favored by scholars who value both elegance and efficiency. Each character emerges from the meeting of ink, brush, paper, and intention, a small miracle of creation that never ceases to amaze me, despite decades of practice. The deeper meaning of calligraphy lies not in perfect reproduction, but in capturing the spirit behind the form, allowing one's own nature to harmonize with the ancient wisdom being transmitted. A flash of lightning illuminates my study, followed by the rolling voice of thunder. In that brief moment of brilliance, I glimpse my collection of books and scrolls, humble compared to great libraries, yet representing years of careful acquisition. Each volume contains not just knowledge, but a relationship. Some were gifts from teachers, others purchased with carefully saved funds during my years as a county magistrate, still others copied by my own hand during visits to more fortunate colleagues. Perhaps there is a peculiar loneliness to scholarly life that few, outside our circles, understand. We converse with ancients more fluently than with our contemporaries, find companionship in texts when human connections prove difficult, measure our days by pages read and characters written rather than more ordinary metrics. Yet in this solitude, there is also communion, with traditions that stretch back unbroken for millennia, with minds whose brilliance continues to illuminate despite their physical absence from the world. The rain has softened now to a gentle patter, like the footsteps of scholars long departed still walking the corridors of learning. I pause in my transcription, watching as another rivulet traces its path down my window, a momentary character written in water, conveying meaning I can sense but not quite grasp. Is this not the essence of our scholarly pursuit? To recognize that the most profound truths always remain slightly beyond full articulation, to chase understanding knowing that complete comprehension forever eludes us. I dip my brush again and continue my work as night fully claims the world outside. There is comfort in this ancient ritual, ink on paper, thought given form, wisdom preserved against time's erosion. Tomorrow's concerns can wait until dawn. Tonight belongs to rain, to tea, to scrolls, and to the quiet conversation between one humble scholar and the endless procession of voices that have come before. The rain continues its gentle symphony against roof tiles and window paper as I set aside my brush. Even the most dedicated scholar must pause to refresh both mind and body. I reach for my tea caddy, a simple ceramic vessel glazed in celadon, green that contains leaves harvested from the misty mountains of Fujian. The caddy itself tells a story. Crafted in the kilns of Longquan during the Southern Song dynasty, its subtle crackled pattern revealing its age to those who know how to read such signs. I handle it with reverence, for it has passed through many scholarly hands before coming into my possession. Tea preparation is no casual matter for those who follow the way of learning. The water must be drawn from the purest source, in my case, collected from this morning's rain before it touched the earth. The great tea master Lu Yu wrote in his Classic of Tea that water from slow-moving mountain streams is best, followed by river water, with well water being merely acceptable. He would certainly approve of rain captured directly from heaven, especially for brewing the delicate white tea I have chosen for this evening's contemplation. I heat the water in a small, iron kettle over the charcoal brazier that warms my study. The proper temperature is crucial. Too hot, and the subtle notes of the leaves will be scorched into bitterness. Too cool, and their essence remains trapped within, reluctant to emerge. For this particular tea, the water should be heated until tiny bubbles, what the ancients called fish eyes, appear along the kettle's inner edge. I watch with practiced attention, listening for the first whispered song of the water as it approaches readiness. While waiting, I select a suitable teacup, unglazed purple clay from Yixing, its porous body seasoned by years of use. Such cups are never washed with soap, but merely rinsed with clear water, allowing them to develop a memory of sorts, each brewing, adding to the cup's character. Some scholars maintain separate cups for different varieties of tea, believing that the vessel eventually becomes an extension of the leaf itself. My own collection is modest but cherished, each cup a companion to specific moods and intellectual pursuits. During the Tang dynasty, when tea first became essential to scholarly life, the leaves were pressed into cakes and broken off as needed, then boiled directly with various spices. It wasn't until the Song period that the practice of brewing loose leaves in a pot emerged, and with it, a more contemplative approach to tea drinking. The Emperor Huizong himself wrote a treatise on tea, Daguan Chalun, describing the perfect cup as having foam white as snow, emerging from the center and disappearing along the edges, with a subtle sound that might be written as shui. Such imperial attention elevated tea from mere beverage to art form. I warm the cup with a small amount of hot water, then discard this preliminary liquid, a gesture of respect that prepares the vessel to receive the tea's essence. The leaves unfurl slowly as I add water to them, releasing a fragrance that fills my small study with notes of orchid, fresh grass, and something ineffable that suggests high mountain air. Watching this transformation, from tightly curled, seemingly lifeless fragments to expansive, vibrant entities, often strikes me as a metaphor for the mind encountering new knowledge. A lesser-known tradition among certain scholarly circles in Jiangnan during the Ming Dynasty involved listening to the tea, placing one's ear near the cup to hear the subtle sounds of leaves unfurling and releasing their essence. This practice was said to cultivate patience and attentiveness, qualities equally valuable in textual study. Though some modern scholars dismiss this as fanciful, I find wisdom in attending to tea with all senses, not merely taste. The first sip is taken in silence, with full attention. The flavor arrives in distinct stages. First, a gentle sweetness on the tip of the tongue, then a complex vegetal fullness that expands across the palate, finally a lingering mineral quality that reminds me of rain-washed stone. This progression mirrors the structure of classical prose: introduction, development, conclusion, teaching composition through sensation rather than instruction. Between sips, I contemplate the journey of these leaves from distant mountains to my humble study. How many hands tended the tea bushes, plucked the tender shoots at precisely the right moment, carefully processed the leaves through withering, oxidation, and drying. The merchant who traded them, the cart driver who transported them, the shopkeeper from whom I purchased them, all form links in a chain connecting my solitary evening to a world of labor and expertise I will never directly witness. An unusual historical footnote: during the currency crisis of the late Tang dynasty, tea was compressed into bricks so standardized they could be used as money in border regions. Scholarship itself was similarly valued. Exam graduates could expect not just positions, but substantial material rewards. Now, in these troubled times of the late Yuan dynasty, both tea and learning seem increasingly precious, yet undervalued by those in power. The Mongol rulers, despite adopting many Chinese customs, have never fully embraced the examination system that sustained scholarly culture for centuries. The rain intensifies momentarily, drawing my attention back to the window. In the scrolls of Zhang Dai, he describes a moment of perfect contentment as rain outside the window, tea in hand, and ancient words before one's eyes. I find myself living within his description, separated by centuries yet united by these simple elements. How many scholars before me have sat thus, cup warming their hands, rain marking time, thoughts wandering between text and sensation. As I pour a second cup, I notice how the leaves have now fully expanded, revealing their complete form. Serrated edges, delicate veins, varying shades of green that suggest the terrain of their growth. There is a Japanese concept called ichigo ichie, one time, one meeting, that captures the uniqueness of each tea ceremony, each gathering, each moment. Though they borrowed this philosophy from Chinese Chan Buddhism, the Japanese refined it specifically within tea culture. I find myself wondering, can a solitary scholar drinking tea alone still experience this singular quality of presence? Or does it require the witnessing of another? The tea whispers its answer in the rising steam, in the subtle variations between sips, in the gradually shifting flavor as the leaves continue their slow surrender to water. Patience reveals what haste overlooks, in brewing tea as in studying ancient texts. Those who demand immediate results will taste only the surface. Those willing to return repeatedly, with humble attention, eventually discover layers of meaning inaccessible to casual examination. Outside, the rain continues its conversation with roof tiles and garden stones, creating a gentle background rhythm for my contemplation. Inside, the tea's warmth spreads through my body, a gentle stimulation that clarifies thought without the agitation of stronger stimulants. Between these two worlds, the external elements and internal sensation, I find the perfect space for scholarly reflection, neither too comfortable nor too austere, balanced on the edge of awareness where insight most often appears. With tea warming my spirit and rain providing gentle accompaniment, I turn my attention to the true purpose of this evening's solitude, a collection of bamboo scrolls recently acquired from a retiring scholar in Hangzhou. Unlike the more common paper or silk manuscripts, these bamboo slips represent an older tradition of textual preservation, dating back to the Warring States period before paper's invention revolutionized Chinese scholarship. Each thin strip of bamboo contains vertical rows of characters, the strips bound together with silk cord to create a flexible document that can be rolled for storage and unfurled for reading. I handle them with extreme care, for their age makes them fragile despite bamboo's natural durability. The earliest known bamboo texts were discovered in tombs dating to the 5th century BCE, preserved by fortunate combinations of soil chemistry and sealed environments. These before me are not nearly so ancient, perhaps from the late Han Dynasty, but still represent a tangible connection to scholars who recorded their thoughts nearly 15 centuries ago. The particular collection I've acquired contains commentaries on the Analects of Confucius, focusing on passages concerning the relationship between knowledge and action. As I carefully untie the binding cord, I cannot help but reflect on the journey these physical objects have taken, created by hands long returned to dust, preserved through dynastic changes, wars, floods, and the simple ravages of time, eventually finding their way to my humble study, where I now become their temporary custodian. The first slip emerges from its protective silk wrapping, revealing characters whose style immediately identifies them as clerical script, popular during the Eastern Han period. The calligraphy itself tells a story beyond the content. Slightly irregular spacing suggests a scholar working without the benefit of printed models, perhaps recording thoughts during or shortly after verbal discourse. One can almost see the rhythm of the original conversation, preserved in the varying pressure of brushstrokes. The master said, "Learning without thought is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous." The familiar passage from the Analects greets me, followed by commentary that elaborates on this warning. The unknown scholar suggests that pure knowledge accumulation without reflective integration creates a burden rather than wisdom, while contemplation untethered from the wisdom of the ancients leads to dangerous innovation that undermines social harmony. Between these extremes, the commentator argues, lies the middle path of true scholarship. A curious practice during the Han Dynasty involved scholars gathering to discuss classical texts, while scribes recorded their interpretations on bamboo slips, creating layered commentaries that preserved multiple perspectives. These records were then circulated among other scholarly communities, generating responses that might take months or years to return to the original discussants. This tradition created a form of asynchronous intellectual community, spanning vast distances and sometimes generations, a dialogue conducted at the pace of foot messengers and horse-drawn carts rather than today's rapid exchanges. I carefully place the first strip aside and continue through the collection, finding that each commentary builds upon previous observations while occasionally challenging established interpretations. The voices emerging from these ancient texts seem to speak directly across time, engaging not just with Confucius and each other, but with me, their future reader. This sensation of dialogue with scholars long dead remains one of the most profound experiences of intellectual life, the feeling that great minds remain somehow present through their recorded thoughts. In one particularly intriguing passage, the commentator references the bone rank system of the Korean kingdom of Silla, comparing it unfavorably to China's meritocratic examination approach to official selection. This reference helps date the text more precisely, as knowledge of Silla's practices became common in China only during the late 7th century. Such unexpected historical details often provide the most reliable method for authenticating and dating anonymous scholarly works. As I work through the commentaries, I notice subtle changes in calligraphic style suggesting multiple hands contributed to this collection. The practice of collaborative commentary reached its peak during the Tang dynasty, when the Emperor Xuanzong established the Hanlin Academy, specifically to produce authoritative interpretations of classical texts. Scholars would gather in specialized halls, surrounded by thousands of manuscript scrolls, engaging in debates that might last for days before reaching consensus on particularly challenging passages. The physical experience of reading bamboo scrolls differs significantly from that of paper books. One must unroll the text gradually, revealing only portions at a time, creating a more linear reading experience that some argue better preserves the original flow of thought. The tactile quality of the material, cool, smooth bamboo beneath the fingertips, connects the reader physically to the natural world from which these writing materials were harvested. The slight resistance as each strip slides against its neighbors produces a subtle sound, unlike the silent turning of paper pages. Midway through the collection, I encounter a commentary discussing the concept of wu wei, non-action, that offers an interpretation I've never encountered before. The unknown scholar suggests that Confucius's apparent emphasis on active virtue and Laozi's advocacy for non-intervention actually represent complementary approaches to the same goal, harmony, achieved through perfectly calibrated response to circumstances. This syncretic interpretation likely reflects the intellectual climate of the Six Dynasties period, when Confucian scholars increasingly incorporated Taoist concepts into their worldview. I pause in my reading, struck by a question that emerges from this ancient attempt to reconcile seemingly opposing philosophical traditions. Do we modern scholars truly engage with the texts we study, allowing them to challenge and transform our understanding? Or do we merely extract what confirms our existing perspectives? These bamboo slips before me represent a scholar who found unexpected connections across philosophical boundaries. Am I equally open to having my intellectual foundations shifted by genuine engagement with the past? The rain has softened to a gentle patter as night deepens around my study. I carefully rewrap each bamboo slip after reading, returning it to its silk protection. The physical care these ancient texts require mirrors the intellectual care needed to properly receive their wisdom: patient attention, gentle handling, respect for their integrity, and willingness to preserve them for future scholars. As I bind the collection with its silk cord, I feel a profound sense of connection to a lineage of scholarship stretching back thousands of years. These bamboo slips have outlived countless scholars, witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, survived wars and natural disasters. They will likely continue their journey long after I have joined the ancestors. In this moment, I understand my role not as owner, but as temporary guardian, a link in the long chain of transmission that keeps ancient wisdom alive across centuries. The rain has settled into a steady rhythm that beckons me away from my desk. I wrap a simple scholar's robe around my shoulders and step out onto the covered walkway that connects my study to the garden pavilion. Though night has fully claimed the world, I navigate by memory and the occasional flash of distant lightning that illuminates the stone path. The garden pavilion has stood for 3 generations of my family. A simple hexagonal structure with upturned eaves and open sides, positioned to capture views of the small pond and carefully arranged rocks that mimic mountainous landscapes in miniature. In Imperial China, garden pavilions evolved from simple rain shelters into essential spaces for scholarly contemplation. During the Song Dynasty, the scholar official Sima Guang designed his famous Garden of Solitary Enjoyment, with multiple pavilions positioned to capture different seasonal views and weather experiences. His writings describe one pavilion specifically, designed for appreciating rain, elevated slightly above a pond so that falling droplets created concentric rings that intersected in mathematically fascinating patterns. Such attention to the aesthetic possibilities of rain viewing became a refined aspect of scholarly life, with the most discerning intellectuals classifying different types of rainfall by sound, intensity, and quality of light. I settle onto the wooden bench, feeling the smooth surface polished by generations of contemplative sitters. The pavilion roof creates a protective boundary between myself and the elements, while still allowing full sensory appreciation of the storm. Directly before me, rain strikes the pond surface with delicate precision, each droplet creating a momentary crown of water before dissolving back into the greater body. To my right, bamboo leaves receive the rain with a gentler percussion, bending slightly under the weight before shedding their liquid burden in a secondary shower. Stone pathways transform into miniature rivers, while moss absorbs moisture silently, deepening from sage to emerald in the darkness. An unusual practice among certain scholarly circles in Jiangnan during the Southern Song period involved counting rain, listening with closed eyes to discern patterns in rainfall, and assigning numerical significance to changes in intensity. This meditative exercise supposedly sharpened both mathematical thinking and poetic sensitivity. The renowned mathematician Qin Jushao was said to have developed aspects of his work on the Chinese remainder theorem while practicing this rain-listening discipline during extended monsoon seasons. Thunder rolls across the distant hills, its voice diminishing as it travels until it reaches my pavilion as merely a suggestion of its original power. Between these celestial drums, I find pockets of profound silence, brief interludes that seem to expand when given proper attention. The 12th century philosopher Zhu Xi wrote that wisdom often resides not in the sound but in the space between sounds, just as meaning in calligraphy emerges equally from the characters and the empty space surrounding them. Tonight, I seek understanding in these intervals, these momentary voids between raindrops and thunder. The pavilion itself represents a philosophical concept central to Chinese intellectual tradition, the ideal of situated removal, of being simultaneously within and apart from the world. From this vantage point, I remain connected to nature's processes while maintaining the distance necessary for reflection. Neither fully immersed nor completely separated, the scholar in the pavilion embodies the balanced position from which true wisdom might emerge. Engaged yet detached, receptive yet discriminating. During the Yuan dynasty, with Mongol rulers suspicious of Chinese scholarly gatherings, garden pavilions took on additional significance as safe spaces for intellectual exchange. Conversations about poetry could mask discussions of politics. Appreciation of landscape painting might disguise commentary on current affairs. The pavilion became not just a space for solitary contemplation, but for carefully concealed community among the learned. Even now, with the dynasty in its twilight years and Mongol control weakening, this habit of coded communication persists among scholars who have never known a time when free expression was truly safe. A particularly forceful gust of wind drives rain beneath the pavilion's protective eaves, spattering my robe with moisture. I do not withdraw but welcome this minor intrusion of the elements. The Tang Dynasty poet Bai Juyi described such moments as heaven's reminder that no boundary we create can fully separate us from the world's essential nature. The slight discomfort of dampness brings my philosophical musings back to physical reality, a balance between abstraction and embodied experience that characterizes the most grounded scholarship. I close my eyes to better focus on the symphony of sounds surrounding me. Rain creates different tones depending on what surface it encounters. Crystalline pings against stone, muffled thumps on wood, the complex patter across varying leaf shapes, and the continuous hiss where it meets the pond. Together, these sounds create a natural music more complex than any court orchestra. The practice of listening to the rain with 10 directions of attention was described in a minor treatise by the reclusive Jin dynasty scholar Zhang Bing, who claimed that developing the ability to simultaneously perceive different aspects of rainfall could extend to scholarly pursuits, allowing one to hold multiple perspectives on a text simultaneously. As I sit in contemplative stillness, I find my thoughts turning to the impermanence that rain so perfectly embodies. Each droplet exists briefly in perfect individual form before merging back into larger bodies of water, eventually returning to clouds to begin the cycle anew. Is this not also the nature of ideas? They emerge as seemingly distinct insights, exist briefly as attributable to individual minds, then merge back into the greater flow of human knowledge, perhaps to precipitate again in new forms through future scholars. My own modest contributions to learning, the commentaries I've written, the students I've guided, the texts I've preserved through careful copying. What will become of them when I, like rain, return to the source? Will fragments survive, nourishing minds yet unborn? Or will they disappear without trace like countless raindrops in an ocean? The pavilion offers no answer, only the continued rhythm of water finding its way from sky to earth, from separation to unity. A sudden flash of lightning illuminates the garden in stark detail, followed almost immediately by thunder that seems to shake the pavilion's wooden frame. The storm's heart passes directly overhead now, no longer a distant phenomenon, but an immediate presence demanding full attention. In this moment of natural drama, all scholarly pretensions fall away. I am simply a human being experiencing the elements, no different from the farmer in his field or the boatman on the river. Perhaps true wisdom begins with this recognition of our shared fundamental condition beneath the various robes and ranks we adopt. When the thunder subsides, the ensuing silence feels especially profound, as if the world holds its breath before resuming its normal rhythms. In this pause between heartbeats of the storm, I find the clarity that has eluded me during hours of textual study, a momentary glimpse of understanding that transcends words. The ancient texts speak of such moments as sudden enlightenment, though I would claim no such grand realization, merely a brief parting of clouds in my own thinking. Returning to my study, I shake droplets from my robe and rekindle the small charcoal brazier. The brief communion with nature has sharpened my senses, preparing me for a different form of contemplation. From a lacquered cabinet, I withdraw a hand scroll of particular significance, a landscape painting depicting the 5 sacred mountains, created by an unknown artist of the Northern Song dynasty. I carefully unfurl it on my desk, weighting the edges with small jade objects to prevent it from rolling closed, revealing a misty scene of towering peaks and diminutive human figures. Chinese landscape painting, known as shan shui, mountain water, developed not merely as aesthetic decoration but as philosophy rendered visible. During the Tang dynasty, the imperial court maintained 6 categories for evaluating paintings, with landscapes ranked below figurative works. By the Song era, however, landscape had ascended to the highest position, recognized as the supreme vehicle for expressing cosmological principles through artistic means. This elevation coincided with Neo-Confucian emphasis on finding moral principles within natural patterns, the belief that mountains and waters manifested the same fundamental forces that should govern human society. As I study the painting before me, the 5 sacred mountains, Tai, Hua, Heng, Heng, a different character but same pronunciation, and Song, emerge from banks of painted mist. The artist has employed the technique of broken ink, pomo, to suggest rather than delineate the distant peaks, allowing formlessness to give birth to form. This method, perfected by the master Fan Quan, creates the paradoxical effect of making mountains appear simultaneously substantial and ethereal, much like the concept scholars pursue through years of study. A fascinating technical detail often overlooked by casual viewers. Traditional Chinese landscape paintings employ three distinct distances or perspectives within a single composition. High distance, Gao Yuan, presents mountains from below, emphasizing their towering majesty. Deep distance, Shen Yuan, creates receding plains that draw the eye into the composition. Level distance, Ping Yuan, provides a frontal view across open space. These perspectives are never used in isolation but layered together, creating a visual experience impossible in physical reality. A composite vision representing complete understanding rather than limited human perception. I trace my finger just above the surface of the silk, following the barely visible path that winds from foreground to distant peaks. Tiny human figures appear at intervals along this route, travelers, scholars, and hermits making pilgrimages through the sacred landscape. Their diminutive size against the vast mountains reflects the proper relationship between humanity and nature according to both Confucian and Taoist thought. We exist within a greater framework that dwarfs our individual concerns, yet provides the context that gives them meaning. During the early Yuan dynasty, a remarkable confluence of painting styles occurred when Mongol conquest forced northern and southern Chinese painting traditions to intermingle as displaced scholars sought refuge across traditional boundaries. The artist Zhao Mengfu, though serving the Yuan court, pioneered an approach that incorporated archaic elements from much earlier periods, arguing that painting, like scholarship, should maintain continuous dialogue with the past, rather than pursuing novelty. This reverence for tradition while allowing subtle innovation characterizes the highest achievements in both Chinese art and scholarship. The mist that shrouds portions of the mountains in this scroll serves multiple purposes, beyond aesthetic beauty. The 11th century painter Guo Shi wrote that clouds and mists in a painting create the rhythm of life breath. Without them, the landscape would be overly lean and unpleasant. On a philosophical level, mist represents the appropriate boundary of knowledge, what should remain partially obscured rather than starkly revealed. Just as excessive clarity in prose makes for mechanical reading, a landscape without mystery becomes mere topography rather than poetic evocation. My own connection to this particular scroll adds another layer of contemplation. It came into my possession through my maternal grandfather, who received it as payment for tutoring the son of a declining noble family during the difficult transition between Song and Yuan rule. Family lore suggests the painting once belonged to the southern Song imperial collection before the capital's fall to Mongol forces. Whether this provenance is accurate matters less than the painting's role in connecting me to a lineage of scholars who found solace and wisdom in these misty peaks during times of both personal and national turbulence. An unusual practice documented during the Northern Song period involved scholar officials gathering to view landscape paintings while composing poetry inspired by the depicted scenes. These painting and poetry gatherings, Hualian Shihui, created a dialogue between visual and literary arts, with participants sometimes inscribing their verses directly onto the painting's mounting. The absence of such inscriptions on this scroll suggests it was primarily used for solitary contemplation, rather than social literary exchange, a more intimate function aligned with my own present circumstances. The viewing of a hand scroll differs, fundamentally, from reading a text or viewing a framed image. The gradual unrolling from right to left creates a temporal dimension to the visual experience, a journey through space that unfolds through time. One never sees the entire composition simultaneously, but experiences it as a progression of revelations. much like life itself, where complete understanding remains always just beyond our grasp, each insight creating context for what follows, without providing total comprehension. As evening deepens around my study, the painted mists seem to blur further, the boundaries between peaks becoming less distinct in the fading light. This visual effect mirrors my own mental state, the clear distinctions established during daytime scholarship softening into more intuitive understanding as night progresses. The Song Dynasty critic Shen Kuo noted that the superior landscape appears clearest in half-light when details recede and essential forms emerge, an observation about both painting and perception that resonates across centuries. I carefully re-roll the scroll, my contemplation complete for now. The 5 sacred mountains return to darkness, their painted forms concealed yet somehow more present in my mind than before viewing. This paradox, that something becomes more vivid through temporary absence, applies equally to visual art and textual study. The scholar's mind continues to engage with works even when they are no longer physically present, perhaps especially so, as memory and imagination complete what brushwork merely suggests. As I secure the scroll with its silk cord, I notice the rain has finally ceased. A new silence fills the night, broken only by the occasional drip from eaves and branches, the world's gradual return to equilibrium after disturbance. This natural rhythm suggests my next scholarly pursuit for the evening, the proper ordering of thoughts disturbed by a day of diverse reading and observation. With the rain symphony concluded, I turn to another ritual of scholarly evenings, the burning of incense to purify the air and focus the mind. From a carved sandalwood box, I select a coil of premium Silk Road incense, its composition a closely guarded secret of Western merchants who trade along the ancient routes connecting our Middle Kingdom to distant lands. The blend contains not just sandalwood and agarwood from southern forests, but traces of frankincense and myrrh from regions so distant they exist as half-legends in most Chinese minds. I place the coil in a bronze censer that has accompanied my scholarly pursuits for 2 decades, its patina deepened by countless evenings of contemplative use. The design features clouds and dragons chasing each other in endless circles around its circumference, a visual metaphor for the cyclical nature of time itself. As I strike a match and touch flame to incense, the first tendril of smoke rises, tentative, searching, like a calligrapher's brush hesitating before the first stroke on fresh paper. The burning of incense in scholarly chambers dates back to, at least the Eastern Han Dynasty, when Kailun's innovation of paper production coincided with the refinement of aromatic compounds. Historical records from the court of Emperor Zheng mention scholars using specific incense blends to enhance mental clarity during examination preparation. Different compositions were believed to stimulate different cognitive functions. Agarwood for memory, sandalwood for logical reasoning, cinnamon for creative thought. Whether these associations held any truth beyond the power of suggestion remains debatable. But the tradition of pairing intellectual work with appropriate aromatics continues unbroken to the present day. As the smoke establishes its upward trajectory, I observe how it forms patterns of remarkable complexity, curling back upon itself, creating momentary architectures in air before dissolving into formlessness. These ephemeral structures remind me of the dynastic cycles that have shaped our civilization, each beginning with clarity of purpose and strong vertical momentum, gradually becoming more elaborate and self-referential, eventually dissipating into the chaos from which new order must emerge. The mandate of heaven is revealed in patterns of smoke, no less than in the movements of celestial bodies, wrote the Tang Dynasty scholar official Liu Zongyuan. His controversial assertion that natural phenomena contained more reliable guidance than ancient texts earned him exile to remote Liuzhou, where, paradoxically, his isolation from court politics produced his most enduring works on governance. I sometimes wonder if the most clear-sighted observations of power's nature come primarily from those positioned at its margins, rather than its center. The incense smoke now fills my study with overlapping layers of scent, the sharp, resinous top notes gradually yielding to deeper, more complex aromas that seem to access memory directly, bypassing ordinary cognition. This phenomenon was documented during the Song dynasty by the polymath Shen Kuo, who proposed that certain aromatic compounds created direct pathways to portions of the brain responsible for storing distant recollections. He recommended specific incense blends for scholars seeking to recall texts memorized in youth, but subsequently forgotten through disuse. A particularly intriguing historical practice emerged during the Six Dynasties period, when political instability made preserving knowledge precarious. Scholars would sometimes infuse their writing inks with trace amounts of distinctive aromatics, believing that encountering the same scent during later reading would enhance recall of the text. This practice of scent encoding knowledge reached its peak during the Northern Song, when the Imperial Library categorized its most precious scrolls, not just by subject, but by the specific incense to be burned while consulting them. The smoke from my censer now moves in two distinct currents, one rising straight upward in the still air near my desk, another caught in a subtle draft from the window, pulling horizontally before dissolving. In this divided flow, I see reflected the great historical schism between Northern and Southern Song, one branch maintaining traditional territorial claims despite practical complications, the other adapting to new circumstances while preserving cultural continuity. Both paths ultimately dispersed into the greater atmosphere of history, their apparent differences significant only in the immediate moment. As I watch these aerial patterns, my mind drifts to the historical text I was studying yesterday, the Comprehensive Mirror for Aid in Government, compiled by Sima Guang. His monumental history traced patterns across 16 dynasties, demonstrating how similar conditions repeatedly produced similar outcomes regardless of the individuals involved. In Smoke's transient forms, I find a perfect visual metaphor for his central insight, that seemingly solid political structures are ultimately as ephemeral as incense trails, their temporary coherence masking their fundamental impermanence. Obscure intellectual tradition practiced primarily in Sichuan during the late Tang period involved reading incense smoke patterns as prognostic tools for assessing current political conditions. Much like divination through oracle bones in ancient times, these scholar officials believed that the natural unpredictability of smoke revealed underlying patterns invisible to ordinary analysis. One practitioner, Lu Zhao, correctly predicted the catastrophic Aleutian Rebellion, after observing how his study's incense smoke divided into 7 distinct columns before dispersing, exactly matching the number of provinces that would break away from imperial control. I do not claim such prophetic gifts, yet watching the smoke's evolution does stimulate historical reflection. The current Yuan dynasty, like all predecessors, emerged from chaos, established order, and now shows signs of the fragmentation that inevitably precedes renewal. The patterns repeat with such consistency that one need not be a diviner to recognize our present position in the cycle. As a scholar, I find strange comfort in this predictability, the knowledge that even dramatic historical ruptures follow comprehensible patterns documented across centuries. The incense has burned halfway through its coil, the smoke now settled into a steady rhythm of ascent and dissolution. I'm reminded of the poem by the Tang dynasty master Li Shangyin. Incense burns in a mist of memory. Yesterday's emotions still linger, while tomorrow's path remains obscured. His deliberate ambiguity about whether he described romantic longing or political disillusionment demonstrates how the finest poetry, like incense smoke itself, contains multiple meanings simultaneously, revealing different aspects depending on the viewer's perspective. As I sit in contemplation, the incense continues its gradual transformation from solid to ethereal, from matter to memory. Each dynasty likewise leaves behind increasingly insubstantial traces, first physical infrastructure, then written records, then folk memories, finally mere echoes in subsequent cultural forms. Yet something essential persists through all these transformations, just as the fragrance remains in my study long after the incense itself has been consumed. Perhaps this persistence represents the true meaning of tradition, not rigid adherence to fading forms, but the continued presence of an essence that survives each necessary transformation. Midnight approaches, yet sleep remains distant. I turn to the stack of bamboo scrolls awaiting my attention, ancient voices eager for conversation across centuries. With reverent hands, I select one bound with faded red silk, untying the delicate cord that has held its secrets intact through countless seasonal changes. The distinctive sound of bamboo strips sliding against one another fills my study, a whispered greeting from scholars long returned to dust. These particular scrolls contain fragments of the lost discourses, philosophical dialogues recorded during the Warring States period but largely destroyed in the Qin dynasty's infamous burning of books. What survived did so through the desperate ingenuity of scholars who buried texts in tomb walls, hid them in well shafts, or committed them to memory for later transcription. The fragments before me were discovered in a forgotten storage chamber of the Provincial Academy, overlooked during successive waves of censorship and political turmoil. I spread the first section carefully on my desk, weighting the edges with small bronze animals that have served this purpose for generations of scholars in my family. The characters before me are written in the clerical script, Lishu, that evolved during the Han Dynasty, more regularized than ancient forms, but retaining a formal dignity that later styles sometimes sacrifice for fluidity. Even the calligraphy itself creates a direct connection to the hand that formed these characters perhaps a millennium ago. When the superior man contemplates the way of heaven, begins the first legible passage. He discovers the same principles in the smallest blade of grass and the movement of distant stars. The unnamed philosopher continues with observations on how proper governance mirrors natural processes, a common theme in early Chinese thought that nevertheless feels startlingly relevant to current conditions under foreign rule. Was the writer addressing only contemporaries, or did he somehow anticipate that his words would reach across time to scholars yet unborn? During the Eastern Jin dynasty, when northern China fell to non-Han conquerors, a remarkable practice emerged among displaced southern scholars. They would gather in garden pavilions similar to mine to read ancient texts aloud, believing that proper vocalization of classical works maintained a cultural continuity that transcended territorial loss. The voice print of ancient wisdom passing through living scholars' mouths was considered a form of preservation more profound than mere physical manuscripts. I continue this tradition now, softly voicing the characters before me, allowing their rhythms to resonate in my study as they once did in academies and courts of vanished dynasties. My finger hovers above a particularly intriguing passage where the bamboo has darkened with age, making the characters difficult to discern. I reach for my magnifying lens, a recent innovation crafted by a glassmaker in Suzhou who adapted techniques from Arab traders. The lens reveals characters that have not been clearly seen perhaps since the Song dynasty, when this copy was likely made from an even older source. The passage discusses how knowledge preserves itself through times of chaos by finding refuge in unexpected vessels, sometimes in the memories of the unlettered, sometimes in texts misclassified to evade destruction, sometimes in interpretive traditions that appear to be about one subject while secretly preserving knowledge of another. A historical curiosity rarely noted in official histories. During the Anlushan rebellion of the mid-Tang dynasty, when the imperial library faced imminent destruction, court scholars devised an ingenious method for preserving essential texts. They distributed portions of the most valuable manuscripts to Buddhist monasteries throughout the empire, disguising classical Confucian works as religious commentaries. This strategic misrepresentation saved countless irreplaceable texts from destruction. The practice created an unexpected legacy of Buddhist monks becoming custodians and transmitters of Confucian classics, a syncretic preservation effort that transcended philosophical boundaries in service to cultural continuity. As I carefully turn to the next section of the scroll, a small fragment breaks away despite my caution. I feel a momentary pang, both personal disappointment at failing in my duty as temporary custodian and a deeper sorrow at witnessing another tiny piece of our collective memory crumble into dust. The impermanence of physical texts contrasts sharply with the seeming immortality of the ideas they contain. Characters may fade from bamboo and silk, yet their meanings continue to shape minds and societies centuries after their original inscription. The Tang Dynasty historian Liu Zhiji wrote in his Comprehensive Perspectives on Historiography that texts exist in three states simultaneously: their physical form, their interpreted meaning, and their active influence on present circumstances. Only the first state is subject to decay. The latter two can actually strengthen over time as successive generations of scholars build layered understanding through accumulated commentary. Perhaps the fragment that just crumbled to dust represents only the least significant aspect of textual existence. I encounter a passage discussing the ethical dimensions of knowledge preservation. The superior scholar recognizes that each text passing through his hands journeys between past and future, with the present scholar serving merely as temporary guardian. To alter a character changes not just a word, but redirects the flow of wisdom between generations. This admonition against casual emendation reflects the profound responsibility Chinese intellectual tradition places on each link in the chain of textual transmission. Even when copying texts, scholars were expected to reproduce even suspected errors faithfully, adding marginal notes rather than correcting the main text. The intimate physical connection with ancient texts creates a form of communion impossible through more casual reading. The slight resistance of bamboo against my fingertips, the faint aroma of age and storage materials, the visible variations in brush pressure that reveal the emotional state of long-dead calligraphers, all create a multi-sensory engagement with the past that transcends mere intellectual comprehension. I become not just recipient of knowledge, but participant in its ongoing embodiment and transmission. A peculiar emotional state often overcomes scholars during late-night engagement with ancient texts, a condition the Song Dynasty bibliophile Yimingde described as temporal transparency, where the boundaries between present and past temporarily dissolve. In this state, one experiences not just intellectual understanding of historical material, but a visceral sense of contemporaneity with its creators. I feel this strange temporal collapse now, as if the study around me might momentarily shift to reveal a Han Dynasty scholar's chamber. The writer of these words looking up with mild surprise at finding a visitor from the distant future. The scroll contains a particularly moving passage about friendship between scholars, separated by great distances, a meditation on how intellectual bonds transcend physical proximity. True companions of the mind need not share wine to share thoughts, the ancient writer observes. Their conversation continues through brush and ink, uninterrupted by mountains and rivers between them. Reading these words, while surrounded by texts from across centuries, I recognize myself as participant in the most expansive conversation imaginable, one that spans not just distance, but time itself. As I carefully re-roll the bamboo slips and retie their silk binding, I reflect on how these fragile objects have outlived every human who has previously handled them. They will likely continue their journey long after I join the ancestors. In this humbling recognition lies the true meaning of scholarship. Not to claim ownership of knowledge, but to serve as its temporary vessel, preserving and contributing to a stream of wisdom that preceded us and will continue long after we return to dust. The hour grows late, yet my scholarly pursuits continue by candlelight. The three flames that illuminate my desk dance with subtle movements, creating a living landscape of light and shadow across my workspace. I carefully trim the wicks with small bronze scissors, a ritual that punctuates my evening studies every hour or so. The candles themselves represent a minor luxury in my modest scholarly existence. Made from the finest beeswax rather than common tallow, they burn with minimal smoke and a gentle honey fragrance that supports rather than distracts from intellectual endeavors. Candle making evolved into a sophisticated craft during the Tang dynasty, when imperial workshops developed techniques for creating candles that combined beeswax with the secretions of the white wax scale insect found primarily in Sichuan province. These specialized candles burned with exceptional clarity and consistency, becoming so valued that regional governors would include them among tribute items sent to the capital. A set of regulations from 832 CE specified that imperial examination halls should be illuminated exclusively with such candles, as their superior light quality prevented eye strain during the grueling 3-day testing process. Position the manuscript I'm currently studying, a commentary on Mencius written during the Northern Song, directly between two candles, allowing their combined light to fall evenly across the page. The characters seem to possess a curious vitality. In this illumination, the interplay of flame-cast shadows creating an almost three-dimensional quality in what would appear flat by daylight. The celebrated calligrapher Ouyang Shun noted that characters reveal their true spirit under candlelight, showing aspects invisible in the uniform clarity of day. This insight explains why many master calligraphers preferred to practice their art during evening hours, an obscure tradition practiced primarily by scholars in Jiangnan during the Southern Song period involved shadow reading. The deliberate positioning of candles to cast text shadows onto blank paper, creating a secondary text that could be traced or simply contemplated as a form of meditative practice. Some believe this technique revealed hidden meanings in classical works, as the distorted shadow characters sometimes combined to suggest alternative readings or connections between seemingly unrelated passages. While dismissed by many as mystical fancy, the practice nonetheless demonstrates how seriously scholars considered the relationship between physical light and intellectual illumination. The shadows cast by my writing implements, brushes standing in their holder, the inkstone with its pool of darkness, scrolls awaiting attention, stretch and contract with the candle's subtle movements. These shifting forms remind me of the famous parable attributed to Zhuangzi about the man who feared his shadow and tried to outrun it, exhausting himself in futile effort. Only when he rested in the shade did both his fears subside. Perhaps there is wisdom in this simple story relevant to scholarship itself, that constantly pursuing knowledge without periods of reflective stillness ultimately defeats its own purpose. Candlelight creates a peculiar intimacy with texts that brighter illumination somehow diminishes. The limited circle of visibility focuses attention completely on the immediate characters, temporarily excluding the remainder of the text, and certainly the broader world beyond my study walls. This forced narrowing of perception paradoxically seems to deepen understanding, as if by concentrating light on fewer characters, their significance intensifies proportionally. During the reign of Emperor Huizong, court scholars documented the practice of single-character contemplation, where one would illuminate just one character at a time with a shielded candle, meditating on its complete meaning before moving to the next. I rotate the manuscript slightly, watching how the changed angle of light reveals previously unnoticed details in the paper's texture and the calligrapher's technique. Brush strokes that appeared uniform in one light now show subtle variations in ink density and pressure. This visual revelation mirrors the intellectual experience of revisiting familiar texts from new perspectives. How passages studied in youth reveal entirely different meanings when examined in maturity, their significance shifting with the accumulated experience of the reader, just as their appearance transforms with changing light. Historical records from the Imperial Library of the Tang Dynasty describe specialized candle stands designed specifically for scholarly use, with adjustable heights, rotating platforms, and polished metal reflectors to maximize illumination while minimizing fire risk. The most elaborate examples included water reservoirs at their bases, not just for safety, but based on the belief that water attracted the essence of clarity, qing yi, thought to enhance mental acuity. While such refined equipment exceeds my modest means, I've adapted common candle holders with small metal reflectors positioned to direct light more effectively onto my work surface. The limited duration of candles creates a natural measurement for nocturnal scholarly sessions. Unlike modern scholars who might work indefinitely under unchanging artificial light, traditional Chinese intellectuals remained acutely aware of time's passage through the gradual diminishment of their illumination. The Song Dynasty scholar official, Su Shi, wrote that the candle's impermanence imposes valuable discipline upon the mind, reminding us with every melting drop of wax that our own time for understanding is similarly finite. This temporal awareness often lent increased urgency and focus to night studies. A particularly fascinating historical practice emerged during the mid-Tang period among certain scholarly circles in Chang'an: the use of revelation candles, jian, ji zhu, manufactured with tiny fragments of aromatic woods or herbs embedded in the wax. As these candles burned down, they would release different scents at roughly hour-long intervals, creating an olfactory timekeeping system while supposedly stimulating different cognitive functions throughout the night. Pine resin for the first hours was believed to enhance memory. Cinnamon for the middle watch supposedly stimulated analytical thinking, while traces of lotus in the candle's final section promoted intuitive connections as dawn approached. As I carefully turned the pages of my manuscript, the characters seem almost to emerge from the paper in the shifting candlelight, casting miniature shadows that create depth where the flat surface should allow none. This visual effect mirrors what the mind itself does with ancient texts, drawing forth meanings that extend beyond the two-dimensional characters, creating intellectual landscapes from flat inscriptions. Perhaps this is why traditional scholarship placed such emphasis on the physical conditions of reading, recognizing that understanding emerges not just from the text itself, but from the complete sensory experience of engagement with it. The candles have burned significantly lower now, their flames slightly dimmer than when I began this session. Soon, I must either replace them or conclude the evening studies. There is a certain melancholy in watching their gradual diminishment, a visible representation of time's passage that daylight studies lack. Yet this same impermanence creates the precious quality of these nocturnal hours, making each moment of illumination more valuable precisely because of its inevitable end. I hold a page slightly closer to the flame, carefully avoiding any risk to the precious document while seeking better illumination of a particularly difficult passage. The characters momentarily appear to shimmer and dance as if alive, an illusion created by the flame's natural movement. For a brief moment, I experience what the Ming Dynasty scholar Guiyu Guang described as the communion of three spirits, Sanhun Jiaohui, the spirit of the ancient author, the spirit of the text itself, and the spirit of the present reader momentarily united through the medium of dancing light. In this fleeting intersection, understanding transcends ordinary comprehension, revealing aspects of meaning inaccessible to purely analytical reading. As I prepare to conclude this portion of my studies, I carefully mark my place with a thin strip of mulberry paper. The candles will soon require replacement, but perhaps enough of the night remains for one more scholarly pursuit before sleep finally claims me. I blow gently across the surface of one flame, watching how it bends without extinguishing, resilient yet responsive to the slightest breath. In this simple interaction between scholar and flame lies an entire philosophy of intellectual life, maintaining one's essential nature while remaining flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, providing light without rigid resistance to the forces that would shape us. As midnight deepens into the territory scholars have long called the Third Watch, I find myself drawn to the philosophical debates that have animated Chinese intellectual life for millennia. I retrieve from my shelves two texts that represent the foundational polarities of our tradition, the Analects of Confucius and the Tao Te Ching of Laozi. Placing them side by side on my desk creates a symbolic dialogue between competing visions of the good life and proper governance that has continued uninterrupted since the Warring States period. Though separated by centuries and philosophical outlooks, these ancient masters continue their eternal debate within the boundaries of my humble study. The physical contrast between the texts themselves tells part of the story. My copy of the Analects is heavily annotated, its margins crowded with commentary from successive generations of scholars. The accumulated insights of 2 millennia of interpretation frame the original text like a river delta formed from countless tributaries of thought. In contrast, my edition of the Tao Te Ching remains relatively unmarked, its cryptic verses resisting definitive interpretation, its wisdom deliberately obscured in paradox and poetic ambiguity. Even in their material form, these texts embody their essential natures. One seeking clarity through accretion of commentary, the other preserving mystery through resistance to final explanation. During the Han Dynasty, an unprecedented attempt at philosophical synthesis emerged under Emperor Wu's reign. His advisor Dong Zhongshu established Confucianism as state orthodoxy, while incorporating elements of legalist governance, Taoist cosmology, and correlative thinking drawn from the 5 elements theory. This syncretic approach created an intellectual framework that would dominate Chinese governance for 2,000 years. Yet beneath this official unity, the fundamental tensions between competing philosophical traditions continued to generate creative friction within the scholarly community. Open the Analects to a well-worn passage. The master said, "At 15, I set my heart on learning. At 30, I took my stand. At 40, I came to be free from doubts. At 50, I understood the decree of heaven. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I could follow my heart's desire without transgressing the norm." Confucius presents a life of gradual refinement through study, self-discipline, and social engagement. A vision of human development embedded within family and state relationships, finding freedom not outside of social constraints, but through their perfect internalization. Turning to the Tao Te Ching, I find its contrasting vision. When the great Tao is forgotten, goodness and morality arise. When wisdom and intelligence appear, great hypocrisy follows. When family relations are no longer harmonious, filial piety and devotion arise. When a nation falls into chaos, patriotism is born. Laozi suggests that explicit virtues emerge only as compensation for their natural decline, that codified morality represents not advancement, but deterioration from an original, unself-conscious harmony with nature's patterns. An intriguing historical footnote rarely mentioned in official histories. During the brief Sui dynasty unification, Emperor Wen sponsored a series of debates between Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist scholars at court. Records describe how participants were seated according to their philosophical affiliation, with court artists creating a remarkable painting depicting these debates that survived until the Aleutian Rebellion. Witnesses described how the emperor would move his seat during particularly compelling arguments, physically repositioning himself to reflect his intellectual alignment with different perspectives. A literal embodiment of the scholar-ruler ideal, engaging directly with competing philosophical traditions. I sip cold tea as I contemplate how these ancient disagreements remain unresolved within my own intellectual life. As a scholar official who has served in provincial administration, I naturally applied Confucian principles of proper relationships and ritual propriety in public governance. Yet in my private contemplation, Taoist insights into simplicity, non-action, wu, and the limitations of language have increasingly shaped my understanding. Perhaps the true wisdom lies not in choosing between these traditions but in learning to apply each where appropriate. Confucian clarity for social engagement, Taoist receptivity for private cultivation. During the Tang Dynasty, the brilliant scholar Han Yu launched what would become known as the ancient prose movement, arguing for a return to pre-Han stylistic clarity as the foundation for intellectual renewal. His famous essay On the Way, Yuan Dao, attempted to reclaim the concept of Tao from Taoist appropriation, asserting that the true way belonged to Confucian tradition. This intellectual campaign represented more than literary preference. It constituted a fundamental attempt to resolve philosophical tensions by reabsorbing competing traditions into a revitalized Confucian orthodoxy. The fact that his movement ultimately failed to eliminate these tensions speaks to their essential and perhaps necessary place in Chinese intellectual life. The candle flames seem to participate in this ancient debate, one burning with steady brightness suggestive of Confucian clarity and consistency, another flickering with Taoist responsiveness to subtle air currents. I watch their interplay across my desk, casting alternate illumination on texts representing fundamentally different approaches to understanding. The Neo-Confucian philosopher Zhu Xi observed that light requires both the flame and the space around it, perhaps suggesting that wisdom emerges not from either tradition in isolation, but from the interaction between defined principles and the openness that contextualizes them. A remarkable practice documented during the Northern Song dynasty involved scholarly, dialectical meditation, where contemplatives would internalize opposing philosophical positions so completely that they could mentally generate dialogue between Confucius and Laozi on contemporary issues. This exercise, influenced by Buddhist dialectical techniques, aimed not at resolving contradictions, but at maintaining them in productive tension. The goal was to develop what one practitioner called simultaneous mind, the ability to hold contradictory truths in awareness, without premature harmonization or rejection. I turn the pages of both texts, allowing their arguments to mingle in my midnight contemplation. The questions they raise remain surprisingly relevant, despite the centuries that separate their authors from my own time. How can we balance individual cultivation with social responsibility? When should we act decisively in the world, and when should we practice non-interference? Is human nature fundamentally good and in need of preservation, or flawed and requiring correction? Can language adequately capture truth, or does it inevitably distort what it attempts to describe? Perhaps the enduring value of these philosophical tensions lies precisely in their resistance to final resolution. Each generation of scholars inherits not answers, but refined questions, not conclusions, but more sophisticated methods of inquiry. In this way, Confucius and Laozi continue their dialogue across millennia, not as fossilized positions, but as living intellectual currents that still shape how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. As the night deepens around my study, I find myself grateful for this inheritance of productive contradiction. The true scholar lives not in dogmatic certainty, but in the fertile space between competing insights, finding wisdom not in final answers, but in increasingly nuanced understanding of the questions themselves. Tomorrow I may need to render administrative judgments with Confucian clarity, but tonight I can dwell in Taoist appreciation of mystery, each mode of thought illuminating the limitations of the other, while contributing to a more complete vision than either could provide alone. The rain returns with gentle insistence, no longer the commanding downpour of early evening, but a patient metronome marking time's passage. I move from my desk to the window, sliding open the wooden frame to allow the petrichor, that distinctive, earthy fragrance of rain meeting dry stone, to infuse my study. Below my window, an ancient stone basin collects the water dripping from the eaves, each droplet creating a momentary crown of ripples before subsiding into the greater body. In the inadequate light of distant lanterns, I can barely discern this aquatic choreography, yet the sound reaches me with perfect clarity, a natural timekeeper counting moments with more precision than any mechanical device. Time measurement in China has evolved through remarkably sophisticated stages since antiquity. During the Han Dynasty, Zhang Heng invented the first seismoscope and water-powered armillary sphere that tracked celestial movements with unprecedented accuracy. By the Tang Dynasty, the engineer Yixing had created water clocks that could maintain accuracy within minutes over weeks of operation. Yet despite these mechanical marvels, scholars have traditionally preferred natural timekeepers. The gradual movement of shadows across garden paths, the opening and closing of certain flowers, and most poetically, the accumulation of raindrops in stone basins like the one I now observe. A historical curiosity rarely documented in official chronicles. During the Northern Song dynasty, the Imperial Observatory maintained a specialized rain chronometer, consisting of 5 stone basins of different dimensions. Court astronomers measured time intervals during cloudy days, when sundials proved useless by observing how quickly rainwater reached designated levels in each basin. The practice combined mathematical precision with an almost poetic appreciation for natural processes as meaningful measures of experience. The exact calculations were recorded in a text called The Measured Rhythm of Heaven's Tears, tragically lost during the Jurchen invasion of 1127. I count the droplets landing in my courtyard basin, 1, 2, 3, attempting to maintain attention on individual drops despite their increasing frequency as the rain intensifies. This meditative practice was first described in a minor work by the Tang Dynasty poet Bai Juyi, who claimed that maintaining focused awareness through 100 consecutive raindrops would generate exceptional mental clarity. When the mind can hold 100 moments of falling water, he wrote, it becomes capable of perceiving the subtle connections between all phenomena under heaven. Whether his claim holds truth or merely poetic license, the practice itself cultivates a quality of attention increasingly rare in our busy world. The relationship between time and water appears throughout Chinese philosophical tradition. The Han Dynasty scholar Dong Zhongshu observed that water flows inevitably downward as time moves inevitably forward, yet both can be temporarily contained in vessels of human creation for specific purposes. This insight informed water clock design, but also suggested a philosophical approach to temporal awareness. That while we cannot stop time's flow, we might develop containers of attention that allow us to make more meaningful use of its passage. Each raindrop striking the stone basin produces a unique sound, some landing directly with a crisp plink, others hitting the basin's edge with a muted tone, still others catching the edge of previous ripples to create complex harmonics. The Song Dynasty musicologist Chen Yang documented 49 distinct rain sounds in his comprehensive compendium of acoustics, arguing that natural precipitation created musical patterns that could be transcribed and reproduced on traditional instruments. While his attempt to create rain concertos found limited appreciation among court musicians, his underlying insight about nature's mathematical musicality influenced developments in both acoustical science and landscape architecture. An intriguing practice emerged during the Southern Song period among scholars in Hangzhou who designed specialized rain pavilions, with roofs constructed of different materials arranged in patterns. During rainfall, these structures produced complex percussive symphonies as drops struck metal, ceramic, wood, and stone elements in sequence. The renowned official Xu Hao reportedly maintained 7 such pavilions around West Lake, each calibrated to different rainfall intensities and seasonal conditions. His essay, On Listening to the Rain's Discourse, compared these natural compositions favorably to court music, arguing that heaven's rhythms contained mathematical perfection no human composer could match. I returned to my desk, but the rain's persistent. Counting draws my attention away from written characters to nature's own record-keeping. The Neo-Confucian philosopher Zhou Dunyi wrote that the superior man recognizes time's passage in natural phenomena rather than mechanical divisions, understanding that true temporal wisdom lies not in precise measurement, but in appropriate response to each moment's particular quality. His insight challenges the scholar to develop what he termed temporal sensitivity, an awareness of time not as abstract quantity, but as qualitative experience worthy of appropriate appreciation. Own relationship with time has transformed through decades of scholarly practice. As a young examination candidate, I experienced time as adversary, a limited resource requiring careful management to memorize sufficient material for success. During my years as a county magistrate, time manifested as administrative rhythm, the regular progression of tax collection, court sessions, and seasonal ceremonies that structured governance. Now, in the autumn of life devoted primarily to scholarship and contemplation, time has become less adversary than companion, its passage marking not depletion, but a gradual deepening of understanding through accumulated experience. Particularly fascinating historical approach to time awareness developed during the mid-Tang dynasty, when the astronomer monk Yi Xing, a remarkable figure who combined Buddhist practice with scientific innovation, created what he called duration, meditation. Practitioners would select natural processes of different temporal scales, a single breath, a burning incense stick, a raindrop's fall, the moon's monthly cycle, and maintain simultaneous awareness of these different time frames. The practice supposedly developed what Yi Xing called temporal flexibility, the ability to experience time's passage appropriate to different activities, rather than remaining locked in a single temporal perspective. As midnight approaches, the rain's rhythm seems to slow, individual drops becoming more distinct as their frequency diminishes. I find myself grateful for this natural conclusion to my evening's contemplation, a gradual diminuendo orchestrated by forces beyond human control, yet perfectly suited to my current needs. Perhaps true temporal wisdom lies in recognizing such harmonies between inner experience and outer phenomena, between the rhythm of thought and the rhythm of rain. I close my window partway, leaving just enough space for the continued sound of raindrops to enter my study while preventing moisture from damaging my manuscripts. The stone basin will continue its patient collection through the night, measuring moments I do not witness, but that nonetheless form part of the continuous flow connecting all experiences. Tomorrow, the basin will hold a small universe of collected time, a minor infinity of moments preserved in nature's own chronicle. The hour grows late, yet my brush remains poised above the inkstone, suspended in that liminal space between thought and expression. I have been transcribing passages from the Classic of Changes with commentary, but now find myself pausing, allowing silence to fill the space where characters would form. This moment of non-action contains its own significance, the necessary interval between exertion where meaning consolidates and clarity emerges. The inkstone before me holds more than just ground ink. It cradles possibilities, the potential energy of thoughts not yet committed to paper. My inkstone has been my companion for over 30 years, a piece of Duan stone from Guangdong province, its surface bearing the subtle depression formed by decades of circular grinding motions. The stone's deep purple-black color with occasional golden flecks reveals its superior quality. During the Tang dynasty, imperial workshops classified inkstones into 18 grades based on texture, density, and water retention properties. The finest stones were so valued that when the renowned calligrapher Ouyang Shun died, his personal inkstone was presented to the emperor as a treasure equivalent to rare jade. I gently place my brush in its rest. A small mountain carved from bamboo, root with 5 peaks representing the sacred mountains of China. The brush's position mirrors my own. Temporarily at rest, yet ready to resume activity when the moment is right. Proper brush handling involves more than mere technical skill. It encompasses a philosophy of care that extends beyond the act of writing itself. The Ming Dynasty scholar Wen Zhenheng wrote extensively on the spiritual dimension of brush maintenance, arguing that respectful treatment of writing implements cultivated similar qualities in human relationships: patience, attention to detail, and appreciation for how each interaction leaves its mark. An obscure tradition practiced primarily by scholars in Suzhou during the Southern Song period involved what was called brush meditation, bichan. After extensive writing sessions, the scholar would place the brush on its rest and spend equal time in silent contemplation of the now inactive tool. The practice supposedly developed greater mindfulness during actual writing by heightening awareness of the transitions between action and rest. One practitioner, the minor poet Zhao Lin, claimed that the universe breathes between brushstrokes. Miss this breath, and your characters, though perfectly formed, will lack vital spirit. The ink in my stone has begun to dry slightly, forming a thin film across its surface. Another sign that rest is appropriate. Fresh ink appears instantly with a few drops of water and gentle circular motion. But scholars have long recognized the wisdom in respecting these natural cycles rather than forcing continuous production. The 4th century calligraphy theorist, Wang Shiji, observed that the finest writing emerges not from constant application, but from knowing when to lift the brush entirely from the page. His insight applies equally to the physical act of writing and the intellectual process of composition. Both require intervals of emptiness to achieve their highest expression. During the Northern Song dynasty, when imperial examinations reached unprecedented importance in determining social mobility, a counter-movement emerged among certain scholarly circles, emphasizing the value of non-productivity. The scholar official Su Shi famously argued that the space between thoughts holds greater wisdom than the thoughts themselves, advocating for scheduled periods of apparent idleness as essential to intellectual development. His essay, On Watching, Ink Dry, compared the gradual darkening of characters on paper to the clarification of ideas in the mind, both processes requiring patience rather than intervention. I lift my brush briefly, examining its tip in the candlelight. The finest brushes use the hair from the ears of Siberian weasels, valued for their perfect combination of resilience and sensitivity. The brushmaker's art involves sorting individual hairs by length, thickness, and flexibility, then arranging them in precise layers around a central core of stiffer hairs. This complex internal structure creates a tool capable of both bold, structural strokes and delicate, hair-thin lines depending on how the calligrapher applies pressure and angle. Like the scholar himself, the brush must embody seemingly contradictory qualities, strength and flexibility, boldness and restraint, to fulfill its purpose properly. A particularly fascinating historical practice documented during the Mid-Tang dynasty involved what scholars called empty writing, sushu. After extensive sessions of actual calligraphy, the practitioner would continue making brush movements in the air above blank paper, forming characters that left no physical trace. This practice supposedly trained the mind to focus on the essential movement patterns underlying character formation, rather than becoming overly concerned with visible results. The renowned calligrapher Zhang Shu reportedly practiced this technique after consuming wine, his empty brushwork becoming so animated that observers claimed they could read the invisible characters from his gestures alone. As I rest between writing sessions, my thoughts drift to the philosophical significance of pauses in intellectual work. The Neo-Confucian scholar Zhu Xi compared the mind to a mountain pool. When constantly disturbed, it reflects nothing clearly. When allowed periods of perfect stillness, it naturally mirrors heaven and earth without distortion. His insight suggests that scholarly productivity paradoxically requires non-productive intervals, periods when the surface of thought becomes still enough to reflect reality accurately, rather than merely projecting our own agitation. The connection between physical rest and intellectual clarity appears consistently throughout Chinese scholarly tradition. The Taoist concept of wu-wei, non-action, found practical application in intellectual work through the recognition that forcing mental effort often produces inferior results to allowing understanding to emerge naturally during periods of apparent inactivity. The Tang Dynasty Buddhist scholar Zongmi adapted this insight for scholarly practice, advocating alternating periods of intense study with intervals of empty awareness, where no specific intellectual goal was pursued. My brush continues its rest as my mind wanders through these historical perspectives on scholarly pauses. There is wisdom in this temporary suspension, not laziness, but recognition that intellectual rhythm requires both exertion and recovery, both focused attention and open receptivity. The scholar Wang Guowei described 3 realms of scholarly Achievement, with the highest level characterized by the ability to move seamlessly between engaged study and detached observation, between asserting the self through writing and dissolving the self through contemplation. Soon I will resume my transcription, refreshed by this interval of apparent inactivity. The inkstone will receive a few drops of water, the brush will lift from its rest, and characters will again flow onto paper. But something essential has occurred in this pause. A gathering of scattered thoughts, a renewal of purpose, a deepening of understanding that could not have happened through continuous activity. As the ancient text reminds us, heaven does not speak, yet the four seasons proceed in order. The sage often remains silent, yet his influence spreads without limit. Sometimes the universe communicates most clearly in the spaces between words. My gaze turns to the wooden shelves lining the eastern wall of my study, where volumes of bound texts and scrolls create a personal library, modest in size, yet curated through decades of careful selection. In the flickering candlelight, dust particles dance above the uppermost shelf, minuscule constellations temporarily illuminated before returning to invisibility. This dust, though seemingly mundane, contains fragments of paper, silk, and binding materials gradually surrendered by the books themselves, a physical manifestation of knowledge slowly returning to elemental form, even as it perpetuates through reading and transcription. Each volume represents not merely content, but connection, to the scholars who created these texts, to those who copied and preserved them through dynastic transitions, and to those who guided these particular copies into my possession. Some were gifts from teachers, others purchased from book merchants during travels to larger cities, still others rescued from neglected collections when their original owners passed into ancestral realms. Together they form what the Song dynasty, bibliophile Yemengde called a spirit garden, a curated landscape of thought where one might wander among the finest minds of successive generations. During the Tang dynasty, private libraries achieved unprecedented significance after the Lushan rebellion severely damaged the imperial collection. The court scholar Liu Zhi documented how private collectors became essential to preserving texts that might otherwise have vanished entirely. His register of hidden books recorded over 300 private collections containing rare manuscripts absent from official holdings. These scholar collectors performed crucial cultural preservation, largely without recognition. Their names now mostly forgotten, while the texts they saved continue to shape Chinese intellectual tradition. I run my finger along the spine of a bound volume containing the collected works of Li Shangyin, a Tang dynasty poet whose cryptic verses resist definitive interpretation despite centuries of scholarly analysis. The book itself carries its own history, independent of its content. Originally hand-copied by a monk in Sichuan during the Northern Song period, later acquired by a provincial official who added marginal notes, eventually passing through multiple owners before reaching my collection through the dispersal of a failing merchant family's library, during drought years when books were sometimes sold by weight rather than title. An unusual practice documented during the Southern Song dynasty involved what scholars called ghost bibliographies, catalogs listing texts known to have existed but subsequently lost to fire, war, or neglect. These meticulous inventories of absence served both practical and memorial purposes, helping scholars locate surviving copies while preserving at least the titles and basic descriptions of works whose content had vanished. The bibliographer Chao Gongwu compiled the most comprehensive such catalog, records of books glimpsed and then lost, containing over 2,000 entries for texts he had personally examined but could no longer locate after the Jurchen invasion, forced the Song court to flee southward. My own collection contains several reconstructed texts, works lost in their original form, but partially recreated through quotations preserved in other sources. The process of textual reconstruction became a specialized scholarly discipline during the Qing dynasty, when evidential research scholars developed sophisticated methods for authenticating fragments and determining their proper arrangement. The reconstructed classic of music assembled from quotations scattered across hundreds of sources, represents perhaps the most ambitious such project, attempting to recover one of the original 6 classics lost during the Qin dynasty's burning of books. Behind the more prominently displayed volumes rest several bound notebooks containing my own humble contributions to scholarly discourse, commentaries on classical texts, historical analyses, and occasional poetry. Unlike imperial court scholars whose works were automatically preserved in official libraries, most provincial intellectuals like myself face the sobering reality that our writings may not survive beyond a generation or two. The Ming Dynasty. Bibliographer Hu Yinglin observed that, "For every name that endures in scholarly memory, 10,000 worthy minds fade into complete obscurity. Their insights lost not through inferiority, but through the simple limitations of transmission." The preservation of books in traditional China involved specialized knowledge now largely forgotten outside scholarly circles. During the Song Dynasty, when private collecting reached unprecedented levels, experts developed methods for protecting texts from the 5 principal threats: fire, water, insects, mold, and theft. Camphor and peppercorns scattered among pages deterred insects. Periodic airing and indirect sunlight prevented mold. Specially designed cabinets with false compartments discouraged thieves. Most elaborate were the systems for fire protection. Some collectors built libraries with surrounding water channels that could be flooded in emergencies, sacrificing the building to save its irreplaceable contents. I carefully removed from its silk wrapper a particularly treasured volume, a hand-copied edition of Wang Anshi's controversial political essays, annotated by a contemporary critic who disagreed with nearly every proposal. The opposing viewpoints preserved side by side create what Neo-Confucian scholars called productive tension, allowing readers to witness intellectual dialogue across time. The physical book itself shows signs of intensive use: dog-eared corners, brush-traced underlines, and marginal notes in at least 3 different hands. Each mark represents a moment when a now anonymous reader engaged deeply enough with the text to leave a trace of their intellectual passage. During the Yuan dynasty, when Mongol rulers initially showed limited interest in Chinese textual tradition, an informal network of scholar librarians emerged to preserve and circulate important works outside official channels. These book guardians, Shu Wei, maintained private collections specifically designed for lending rather than personal use, creating what the literary scholar Zhou Mi called invisible libraries that existed primarily through circulation rather than fixed location. Some maintained specialized collections in narrow subject areas: medical texts, local histories, or Buddhist commentaries, creating a distributed preservation system more resilient than centralized imperial libraries to political disruption. The uppermost shelf of my collection holds volumes rarely consulted but maintained out of reverence. Texts by now forgotten scholars whose works contain insights that deserve remembrance despite their author's obscurity. The Song Dynasty Bibliophile. Yu Mao wrote poignantly of such overlooked genius in his essay On Unknown Scholars, arguing that true intellectual worth correlates imperfectly with historical remembrance. Fame preserves some names through accident or circumstance, while superior minds may leave only fading traces in neglected volumes. His observation finds physical manifestation in these dusty upper shelves, where worthy thoughts await rediscovery by future readers. The relationship between books as physical objects and knowledge as intellectual inheritance occupies a central place in Chinese scholarly tradition. The Neo-Confucian philosopher Cheng Yi distinguished between dead book learning, focusing exclusively on textual transmission, and living wisdom, the integration of textual knowledge with personal experience and moral development. Yet he also recognized that without physical preservation of texts, the continuity of tradition would fracture. This tension between reverence for books as objects and recognition of their limitations as vessels for wisdom shapes how scholars approach their personal libraries. As night deepens around my study, I return the volume to its place among its companions on the shelf. Each book resumes its patient waiting for the next reading, the next engagement with a living mind that temporarily animates its dormant wisdom. Like the dust that accumulates between consultations, time settles upon these texts, neither enhancing nor diminishing their intrinsic value, but marking the intervals of attention they receive. In this modest collection, as in the great libraries of the empire, volumes of unremembered genius line shelves like patient ghosts, waiting for moments of resurrection through the simple yet profound act of opening their pages to fresh eyes. From beyond my window comes the distinctive call of a night heron. 3 measured notes followed by silence, then repeated with slight variation. My scholarly reverie pauses as I attend to this natural interruption. Other nocturnal birds soon join this solitary vocalist, the melancholy descending trill of a bamboo partridge, the rhythmic hooting of a mountain owl, and occasionally the sharp cry of a passing curlew. These avian dialogues across the darkness strike me as curiously parallel to the correspondence between scholars. Calls and responses traveling across distance, each voice distinct yet participating in a greater conversation. Bird watching has long occupied a place in scholarly tradition, though night birds hold special significance. During the Eastern Jin dynasty, the reclusive poet Tao Yuanming documented 37 distinct nightbird calls in his garden, associating each with different emotional and intellectual states. He claimed the plaintive cry of the night heron specifically conducive to philosophical reflection, writing that its voice carries the perfect blend of melancholy and clarity that opens the mind to deeper understanding. Whether through objective quality or subjective association, certain birds became linked with scholarly pursuits in traditional Chinese culture. I move closer to the window, allowing the cool night air to carry these natural voices more clearly into my study. The mountain owl calls again, a sound the Tang Dynasty poet Li he described as the voice of abandoned temples questioning empty skies. Birds in Chinese intellectual tradition often serve as mediators between realms, creatures of earth capable of ascending toward heaven, their migrations tracking celestial patterns while their bodies remain subject to earthly limitations. In this capacity, they mirror the scholar's condition, physically constrained yet intellectually mobile, capable of traversing vast conceptual territories while remaining rooted in particular time and place. An obscure practice documented primarily in Sichuan during the mid-Tang period involved what scholars called night-bird correspondence. Intellectuals living within hearing distance of each other would position themselves near windows or garden pavilions during evening hours, using bird calls as signals to indicate different activities. 3 quick whistles mimicking a thrush might indicate a significant discovery in one's reading, deserving immediate discussion. The cry of a night heron reproduced with surprising accuracy by trained scholars could request the loan of a specific text by morning. This system allowed communication without disturbing meditation or requiring the formality of written messages for minor matters. The calls continue intermittently, creating what the Song Dynasty naturalist Shen Kuo called nature's dispersed conversation, a dialogue without central direction, yet maintaining internal coherence through its own organic patterns. His treatise on avian communications proposed that bird calls followed grammatical structures analogous to human language, with specific temporal relationships between sounds conveying different meanings depending on season and circumstance. While modern ornithology might question his specific claims, his underlying insight about pattern and meaning in natural communications reflects the scholarly tendency to seek coherent systems within apparent randomness. During periods of political persecution, when open intellectual exchange became dangerous, subtle references to bird communications appeared in scholarly correspondence as coded language. The expression, "when night herons call," emerged during the early Ming Dynasty as a veiled reference to clandestine intellectual gatherings. The renowned philosopher Wang Yangming, during his exile to remote Guizhou province, reportedly maintained contact with his disciples through letters ostensibly about birdwatching that contained philosophical teachings embedded within ornithological observations. The night birds served not just as metaphor, but as practical cover for continuing scholarly dialogue during hostile times. I listen more intently as the bamboo partridge calls again from the darkness. Its distinctive pattern, 3 descending, notes followed by 2 ascending, carries perfectly through the night air from considerable distance. This remarkable acoustic efficiency inspired the development of specialized long-distance communication during the Tang Dynasty, when frontier officials adapted bird calls into coded signals capable of traveling between watchtowers. The system eventually formalized into what military historians call bird pattern signaling, with different calls indicating various types of information, from enemy movements to requests for supplies, that could cross distances in seconds, rather than the hours required for physical messengers. The geographical dispersion of China's scholarly community necessitated sophisticated communication networks long before modern technology. During the Song Dynasty, when intellectual culture reached unprecedented sophistication, scholars developed remarkably effective systems for maintaining dialogue across vast distances. The letter societies, Qidu Hui, established in major cities, created regular courier routes between members, with shared costs making frequent correspondence affordable for even modest scholars. These networks transmitted not just personal messages, but circulated new texts, commentary, and scholarly debates across provinces, creating what the bibliographer Chao Gongwu called a commonwealth of minds independent of physical proximity. A night bird I cannot identify calls once, its voice unfamiliar yet somehow appropriate to this moment of reflection. The soundscape beyond my window contains both recognizable patterns and mysterious elements. Much like the intellectual landscape, I navigate through my studies. The Song Dynasty poet Su Shi compared scholarly progress to following night birds through a darkened forest, guided by voices while the path remains invisible. His metaphor captures the essence of intellectual exploration, proceeding through uncertainty guided by the voices of those we cannot see, trusting that meaningful connection exists despite apparent isolation. Historical records from the latter Han Dynasty describe how the scholar Kai Yang, exiled to a remote region, would listen for night birds that migrated from the capital region, believing they carried the scholarly atmosphere, Zhui Feng, of distant intellectual centers. While we might dismiss this as mere poetic fancy, his intuition about the importance of maintaining connection with broader intellectual currents remains relevant. True scholarship rarely thrives in complete isolation. Even reclusive masters maintained forms of dialogue with tradition and contemporaries through various channels of communication, from formal correspondence to the shared experience of natural phenomena like bird migrations and seasonal changes. The periodic silence between bird calls creates spaces as meaningful as the calls themselves, intervals where anticipation and reflection naturally arise. The Ming Dynasty scholar Gui Yuguang observed that communication between true scholars resembles the night bird's chorus, each voice distinct, the pauses between as essential as the sounds, no voice dominating yet all participating in a harmony that transcends individual contribution. His insight suggests that scholarly dialogue achieves its highest form when it balances assertion with receptivity, statement with silence, individual perspective with collective understanding. As I prepare to return to my desk and resume work, the night heron calls once more. Perhaps the same individual that first interrupted my studies, now concluding the natural symposium that has occupied the darkness. I find myself grateful for this avian interruption that connected my solitary pursuits to the broader world of living things. The scholar's path, while often solitary in its immediate experience, exists within a vast network of connections, to nature, to tradition, to contemporaries engaged in parallel pursuits, and to future readers yet unborn who may someday engage with our recorded thoughts. The night birds fall silent as the hour grows late. But the conversation they represent continues across countless studies where other scholars, unknown to me yet kindred in purpose, pursue their own paths of understanding. Between our isolated towers of learning, these natural voices have momentarily bridged the necessary solitude of scholarly life with reminders of a larger community, both human and more than human, within which all knowledge ultimately finds its proper context. The deepest hours of night give way almost imperceptibly to the first intimations of dawn. No clear boundary exists between darkness and coming light, only a gradual shift in quality that the attentive mind perceives before any visible evidence appears. Poetry often arrives in the same manner, emerging not through deliberate summoning but as an unbidden harbinger of clarity after long hours of scholarly contemplation. I reach for a slim volume of blank paper bound with simple thread, my poetry journal, companion to these liminal hours when verse flows more readily than during daylight's more structured thinking. The practice of composing poetry during the transition from night to dawn has a distinguished lineage in Chinese literary tradition. The Tang dynasty master Du Fu reportedly maintained what he called his between night and day scroll, reserved exclusively for verses that came to him during this boundary time. He believed such compositions possessed unique qualities impossible to achieve during full darkness or complete light, a transitional wisdom reflecting the mind's movement between subconscious depths and waking clarity. Modern readers can identify these dawn compositions in his collected works through their distinctive imagery and tonal qualities, creating a subcategory within his vast output that scholars still study for their particular characteristics. Moisten my brush and prepare fresh ink, though only enough for brief notation rather than extended composition. The poetry of this hour tends toward fragmentary illumination, rather than structured completion. Impressions and insights that arrive in condensed form, often requiring later refinement. The Song Dynasty poet Su Shi described this process as catching morning dew before it evaporates, preserving momentary clarity that might otherwise dissipate with full wakefulness. His famous Dawn notebooks contained initial versions of poems later expanded into some of his most celebrated works, demonstrating how these boundary time impressions often contained the essential seed of more developed compositions. Historical records from the Northern Song period document the existence of informal dawn poetry societies, Xiao Chen Shi Shi, in several regional capitals. These groups of scholar officials would gather periodically to compose poetry during the transition from night to morning, with strict rules requiring that composition begin in darkness and conclude with the first visible light. The resulting verses were not judged by conventional standards of technical perfection, but rather by how effectively they captured the distinctive consciousness of this liminal state. Few collections from these societies survive intact, but scattered poems bearing the notation, "written between night and dawn," appear in various anthologies, recognizable by their dreamlike imagery and philosophical directness. I write several lines that have been forming in my mind over the past hour. Between nightbird's final calls and morning's first light, 10,000 volumes wait in perfect silence. The scholar's candle burns in both directions, illuminating ancient thoughts and coming day. The lines emerge without conscious planning, reflecting both my immediate circumstances and broader patterns of scholarly experience. Poetry written during this boundary time often exhibits this quality, simultaneously personal and universal, specific to the moment yet resonating beyond individual experience. The Jin Dynasty poet Lu Yu maintained that dawn verses reveal the meeting point between the scholar's individual mind and the greater consciousness of tradition, suggesting that this particular time facilitated a form of composition where personal voice and cultural inheritance achieved optimal balance. An intriguing practice documented primarily in Jiangnan during the Southern Song period involved what scholars called dream-waking poetry, Meng Xing Shi. Practitioners would deliberately interrupt their sleep shortly before dawn, composing verses in a state between dreaming and wakefulness before returning to sleep until full morning. These compositions were considered particularly valuable for philosophical insight, as they supposedly accessed knowledge beyond ordinary conscious formulation. The Neo-Confucian philosopher Zhu Xi, though generally skeptical of literary indulgence, specifically exempted this practice from his criticisms of poetry, considering it a legitimate method for accessing deeper understanding of principle, lie. The faintest lightening of the eastern sky becomes perceptible through my window. Not yet dawn, but its distant promise. I note this subtle shift in my verse. Ink-dark sky reluctantly surrenders, its eastern edge to the inevitable brush that writes each day anew. First light reveals not objects, but their possibility. The relationship between poetry and philosophical clarity occupies a central position in Chinese intellectual tradition. Unlike Western traditions that often separated poetic and analytical modes of thought, Chinese scholars traditionally viewed poetry as a necessary complement to logical analysis, accessing truths inaccessible through purely discursive reasoning. The Tang Dynasty scholar Han Yu, primarily known for his prose writings, insisted that the superior scholar requires both logical precision and poetic intuition, as the two eyes provide depth perception impossible with either alone. This integration of cognitive modes reached its fullest expression in dawn poetry, where the mind naturally balanced between analytical and intuitive functions. Historical treatises on literary composition frequently emphasize the distinctive quality of morning consciousness. The Ming Dynasty literary theorist Yang Shen identified 5 distinct states of mind conducive to different forms of writing: early morning for philosophical insight, late morning for historical analysis, afternoon for social commentary, evening for aesthetic appreciation, and late night for emotional expression. His Treatise on Temporal Composition recommended that scholars maintain separate writing implements for each period, physically embodying the different qualities of thought associated with each phase of the day-night cycle. As the light gradually strengthens, birds different from their nocturnal counterparts begin their morning communications, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence. These dawn singers inspired a specialized poetic form during the Southern Song dynasty called bird-waking verse, Niao Xingju, where each line corresponded to a specific bird's morning call, arranged in the actual sequence they began singing. The renowned poet Yang Wanli mastered this form, creating compositions that functioned simultaneously as accurate ornithological records and profound reflections on natural order. The form exemplifies how Chinese poetic tradition frequently integrated scientific observation with aesthetic and philosophical purposes. I add a final couplet to my dawn composition. Morning birds translate night's silence into questions the new day must answer. The brush moves almost of its own accord, the characters forming with a fluid immediacy different from my more deliberate calligraphy of earlier hours. This phenomenon, the distinctive quality of dawn writing, was noted by the Jin dynasty calligrapher Wang Xizhi, who maintained that characters written during the transition to morning possessed a balanced energy impossible to achieve at other times. His famous dawn practice method recommended reserving the most challenging calligraphic exercises for this specific period, when the body's energy systems supposedly achieved optimal balance between yin and yang influences. As true dawn approaches, I place my brush in its rest one final time this night. The poem remains unfinished, as dawn verses often do. Fragmentary impressions rather than completed compositions. Questions rather than conclusions. Their value lies precisely in this quality of openness, this resistance to premature closure. The Song dynasty poet Lu Yu compared such dawn fragments to half-open scrolls that invite the reader to continue unrolling, beginnings that generate momentum carrying forward into daylight's more structured thinking. The gradual lightening beyond my window promises the transition to a new day, with different scholarly tasks and mental qualities than those that occupied the night. Yet the poetry composed in these boundary hours creates a bridge between these states of consciousness, preserving night's insights for day's development. In this continuity lies the true rhythm of scholarly life, not rigid separation of activities, but fluid movement between complementary modes of understanding, each enriching the other through their difference. First light arrives not as a sudden presence, but as a gradual unveiling of what already exists. My study, populated with familiar objects throughout the night, now reveals itself anew, as dawn's clarity replaces candlelight's intimate shadows. Scrolls, brushes, and books emerge from darkness like mountains appearing through dispersing mist, their essential nature unchanged, yet somehow transformed by this fresh illumination. I extinguish the candles that have served as faithful companions. Through my nocturnal scholarship, their purpose fulfilled as heaven's own lamp takes precedence. With practiced movements, I prepare for the day's intellectual labors. From a cedar cabinet, I withdraw several sheets of blank paper, surfaces yet unmarked, awaiting the impression of brush and mind. This daily ritual of preparing fresh writing materials embodies the scholar's perpetual position between accumulated wisdom and new creation. The Tang Dynasty master calligrapher Yu Shinan compared blank paper to fields of snow awaiting footprints, pure potential that simultaneously invites contribution and induces humility before its perfect emptiness. Select several sheets of the finest bamboo paper, produced in Anhui province using techniques refined over centuries. The paper-making tradition reached its technical peak during the Southern Song Dynasty, when imperial workshops developed methods for creating surfaces specifically calibrated for different types of writing. Historical records describe specialized papers for various purposes: smooth white sheets for formal calligraphy, slightly absorbent yellow paper for draft composition, textured surfaces for poetry, and thicker stock for official documents. The renowned papermaker Kai Lun reportedly tested his creations by writing the same character on different samples and examining how each surface received the ink's impression. As I arrange these blank pages on my desk, I consider their significance within the cycle of scholarly life. The Northern Song philosopher Zhang Zai observed that empty pages represent the scholar's highest responsibility, to transform personal understanding into shared wisdom. His insight captures the ethical dimension of scholarly writing, the obligation to contribute to an ongoing conversation, rather than merely accumulating private knowledge. Each blank sheet carries this implicit challenge. What will you add to the vast repository of human understanding that justifies the trees surrendered to create these pages? The preparation of writing materials for a new day's work follows patterns, established across generations of scholarly practice. During the Ming Dynasty, the philosopher Wang Yangming documented what he called the 7 preparations, qi bei, that should precede any significant writing project: arranging the physical space, purifying one's intentions, reviewing relevant sources, clarifying central questions, outlining main arguments, considering potential objections, and finally, preparing fresh materials for composition. This methodical approach reflects the view that meaningful contribution requires both extensive preparation and receptivity to new insight. Outside my window, birdsong has fully replaced the night silence, their overlapping voices creating what the Song Dynasty naturalist Shen Kuo called the morning parliament of trees, each species adding its distinctive voice to a natural discourse that precedes and will outlast human conversation. These avian dialogues provide a fitting accompaniment to the scholar's preparations, a reminder that our intellectual endeavors exist within broader patterns of communication that encompass the entire living world. I carefully select a brush appropriate for today's primary writing task, a commentary on recently discovered fragments of Han Dynasty administrative records. The brush features weasel hair of medium flexibility, suitable for the semi-formal script this project requires. According to the Ming Dynasty scholar official Wang Chong, different writing implements subtly influence not just the physical appearance of characters, but the actual content of thought. The wide brush encourages expansive thinking. The fine-tipped brush promotes precision. The brush of balanced qualities supports integrated understanding. Whether such correlations reflect physical reality or psychological association, the selection of tools remains an essential aspect of scholarly preparation. The historical approach to beginning new scholarly projects underwent significant evolution across dynasties. During the Han period, scholars typically began major works with elaborate prefatory material, establishing their lineage within existing textual traditions. By the Tang dynasty, a more direct approach had emerged, with scholars beginning from clearly stated questions rather than extensive positioning within tradition. The Song Neo-Confucians developed a dialectical method where new works often began by identifying apparent contradictions in classical texts before proposing resolutions. Each approach reflected different understandings of how new knowledge relates to established wisdom. An obscure practice documented primarily in Jiangnan during the late Ming period involved what scholars called ancestral consultation, wenzu, before beginning significant writing projects. The scholar would place blank paper and writing implements before the family altar overnight, then examine them in early morning for any subtle changes, a moved brush, shifted paper, or other anomalies that might suggest ancestral guidance about the proposed project. While obviously susceptible to confirmation bias and subtle air movements, the practice nevertheless embodied an important recognition that new scholarly works emerge from complex interactions between individual creativity and inherited tradition. The first full sunlight now enters my study, illuminating dust particles that dance in its beam, ephemeral constellations that form and dissolve in endless variation. I cannot help but see in these illuminated motes a metaphor for scholarly insights themselves. Briefly visible when caught in the right light, suspended between materiality and immateriality, following patterns both random and determined. The Song Dynasty poet Lu Yu compared moments of intellectual clarity to dust in a sunbeam, simultaneously inconsequential and radiant, substantial enough to reflect light, yet insubstantial enough to float on air. As I arrange my materials for the day's work, I reflect on the cyclical nature of scholarly life. How each day's blank pages await insights partially formed during night's contemplation. How each generation's contributions build upon foundations, laid by predecessors while creating ground for those who will follow. The Ming Dynasty philosopher Li Ji compared this process to the agricultural cycle. Previous scholars till the soil and plant seeds. We tend and harvest their plantings while sowing new varieties. Future scholars will cultivate what we have only begun to imagine. With my writing implements arranged and fresh paper awaiting, I find myself at that precious threshold between preparation and execution, between potential and actualization. This moment, poised before blank pages with brush in hand, morning, light illuminating both ancient texts and fresh paper, contains the essential paradox of scholarly existence. We simultaneously serve as recipients of accumulated wisdom and creators of new understanding, both vessels and fountains, interpreting the past while shaping how future generations will interpret us. The Tang Dynasty historian Liu Jiji captured this paradox in his observation that the truly valuable text is both thoroughly derivative and completely original, drawing deep nourishment from tradition, while contributing something genuinely new to the ongoing conversation. As I prepare to make my own modest additions to this vast dialogue, I find comfort in recognizing my place within this lineage, neither its beginning nor its end, but a necessary link between what has been thought and what remains to be discovered. The blank pages before me await, not with emptiness, but with possibility. Like the new day itself, they contain both the promise of discovery and the responsibility of creation. I dip my brush in newly prepared ink and begin. Mountains dissolve into watercolor shadows as night finally surrenders to the full authority of day. The transition complete, the dream of darkness transforming into waking reality. I stand at the threshold between these worlds, feeling the boundary between what was and what might be growing thinner with each passing moment, like mist evaporating from a still lake at sunrise. leaving only clear reflection where mystery once dwelled. The journey through night's contemplations has carried me across territories both familiar and unexplored, through silent dialogues with ancient texts, through the music of falling rain on stone basins, through the midnight conversations of birds whose voices bridge solitudes, through the dance of candlelight across characters written by hands, long returned to dust. The light now bathes everything in gold, transforming the ordinary into the sacred, revealing how thin the veil has always been between mundane existence and profound meaning, between solitary study and communion with minds across centuries, between the finite vessel of individual understanding and the infinite ocean of collective wisdom toward which all scholarly streams ultimately flow. Perhaps all meaningful intellectual journeys follow this pattern, beginning in the darkness of unknowing, proceeding through the shadows of partial comprehension, and occasionally opening into moments of illumination that reveal not just external subjects but internal landscapes previously hidden even from ourselves, territories of understanding that existed as potential before language gave them form. As I prepare to close these reflections on a scholar's evening, I find myself grateful for the humble implements that enable this ancient conversation: the brush whose movements connect hand to mind, the paper that receives impressions more lasting than the hand that creates them, the ink that transforms invisible thought into visible legacy, and most profoundly, the tradition itself that provides both foundation and context for whatever small contributions one might offer to its continuing flow. Like water finding its way from mountain heights to distant seas, the stream of understanding passes through each scholar's hands, momentarily taking the shape of their particular vessel before continuing its journey toward horizons beyond individual sight. Good night, time traveler. May your rest be as light as the footprints we leave in the sand of history.